So we've talked about the human population, but the next thing we want to talk about is humans' use of resources and pollution. A resource is anything from a biotic or an abiotic environment that helps meet needs, so things like land, water, food, energy, minerals. An ecological footprint is the amount of resources that's used by an individual. A person can help reduce their ecological footprint by driving an energy-efficient car, living in a smaller house, eating vegetables as opposed to meat. There are a lot of things that can be done to help reduce your ecological footprint. Some resources are non-renewable, some are renewable. Non-renewable resources are going to be limited in supply, so things like land, fossil fuels, minerals, all of those can be eventually exhausted. Renewable resources can be naturally replenished, water, solar energy, plants, and animals. Now, of course, renewable energies can be replenished, but it's important to note that they must be given time to be allowed to replenish. It is possible to deplete our sources faster than they can be replenished. Pollution is any undesired alteration of the environment. As the population grows, so does the need for resources, and the amount of pollution is going to increase as well. The consumption of mineral and energy resources has grown faster than population size in the last few years. Great example of uses of land and the causes of pollution would be beaches and human habitation. Over 40% of the world population lives within 60 miles of a coastline. Now, this can cause beach erosion, cause loss of habitat for marine organisms. It also causes the loss of a buffer zone during storms. Coastal wetlands are going to be impacted when people fill them in. They are spawning areas for marine life, and they help protect coastal areas from storms. But when humans move in and start to erode those shorelines, we lose those buffer areas and we lose those huge habitats for wildlife. In contrast to beaches, 40% of all land on the earth is desert. Desertification is the conversion of semi-arid land to desert land, and unfortunately, desertification is happening at a pretty rapid pace. A lot of times this begins in areas when humans allow their animals to overgraze the land. The soil can no longer hold the rainwater. Without plants there are no roots. There are no roots to hold the soil in place. There's no roots to absorb the water as it comes out, or to absorb the rainwater as it falls. If the soil cannot hold rainwater, then the soil cannot support vegetation. The area is then going to be abandoned and people move on. Some ecologists think that nearly 3/4 of all rangelands are in danger of desertification. Deforestation looks very similar to desertification. Deforestation is simply the removal of trees. This is typically done to allow humans to live in areas where there used to be forests. However, the deforestation, removing of all of those trees, can ultimately lead to desertification. There's a lot of D words here. Deforestation is the removal of the trees. However, when we remove all that vegetation, especially trees have really deep roots. So they are excellent for holding soil in place. They're excellent for holding water in the soil. But without those trees, without that vegetation, we're going to see a loss of vegetation in general. And when we lose that vegetation in general, it can lead to the desertification. Water is a pretty limited resource. Most fresh water is used by industry and agriculture. About 70% of fresh water is used just to irrigate our crops. In the more developed countries, more water is usually used for bathing, flushing toilets, watering lawns, than for drinking or cooking. Globally, the needs of humans do not exceed the renewable supply of fresh water. So that's great. But that's considered on a global scale. So globally, we are keeping up with the renewing of water, freshwater resources. But this is not the case in every region of the world. 40% of the land is desert, with deserts being bordered by semi-arid land. And that desertification is spreading. Deserts are spreading. The semi-arid land is being depleted. In order to live in that semi-arid land, humans are going to have to increase the availability of fresh water by damming rivers and withdrawing water from aquifers. This is going to naturally deplete the renewable resource of water in that area. Dams. Dams are pretty interesting. About 57,000 large dams in the world catch about 14% of all precipitation runoff and provide water for 40% of irrigated land. This also gives 65 countries more of half of their electricity. Damming of rivers has been so extensive that some don't really flow as they once did. So, for example, the Yellow River in China fails to reach the sea most years. Dams have other drawbacks as well. Loss of water by evaporation and seepage. The amount lost can equal the amount made available. So the salt left behind by evaporation and agricultural runoff greatly increases the salinity of the river. So although we can use it as sort of a renewable resource for creating both electricity and also making water readily available, it can significantly decrease the quality of the river and the quality of the water that is flowing back out of the dam. Aquifers. Aquifers are going to be underground water reserves. People are pumping vast amounts of water from them to help meet their freshwater needs. In parts of the higher plains aquifer from South Dakota to Texas, more than half of the water has already been pumped out. And removal of water from aquifers causes land subsidence, which is sort of the settling of soil as it dries out. So there are areas in California that have subsided about 9 meters due to groundwater depletion. Subsidence can damage canals, buildings, and underground pipes. It also can cause sinkholes, which form when an underground cavern collapses because there's no water to keep it full. There are a lot of consequences to groundwater depletion, one of those being saltwater intrusion. The flow of water actually keeps streams and aquifers free of salt water. As the water is withdrawn, the water table can lower to the point where seawater will back up into those streams and aquifers. This is ultimately going to reduce the supply of fresh water along the coast. Sources of water pollution are going to be classified in one of two ways. Either as point sources, where they can be traced to a specific source and location, or non-point sources, where we cannot really identify the location of the source of contamination. Biological magnification occurs as toxic chemicals pass along the food chain. Pollutants become increasingly concentrated as each higher consumer level because they are not being excreted. So a great example of biological magnification would be the buildup of mercury in fishes. Mercury is found in really, really small amounts in the natural water sources. However, it isn't being excreted from the body. So algae take up that mercury, and then fish who eat lots of algae containing that mercury have that mercury built up in their bloodstream. Larger fish who eat those fish who contain mercury are going to see an even greater increase of mercury in their bloodstream because each fish they eat has a little bit of mercury in it, and at each stage it's not being used by the body and it's not being excreted from the body. So that's just an example of biological magnification. Aquatic food chains are more likely to experience the biological magnification just because there are more links than in the terrestrial food chain. There are going to be more fish feeding on single point resources in an aquatic environment than in terrestrial environment where there's the ability to migrate and rely on other food sources. Mercury levels can be really high in top consumers like sharks, swordfish, and tuna. Waste dumping occurs at the sea, but currents can transport that trash back to shore. Offshore mining and shipping add pollutants to the oceans. Large oil spills kill plankton, fish, shellfish, birds, marine animals. So there are a couple of things that can be done, and there are a lot of individuals hard at work taking measures to conserve water. There are certain things that can be done, like planting drought-resistant and salt-tolerant crops that would help conserve water. Drought-resistant crops wouldn't require quite as much groundwater to be brought to them. if they could also be salt-tolerant crops, seawater could be used to irrigate the soil as opposed to using fresh water. Using drip irrigation delivers more water to crops to help increase crop yields. Governments subsidize irrigation so that farmers have little incentive to invest in water-saving methods at this point. But if governments chose to not subsidize irrigation, it would put more pressure on farmers to find other ways to conserve water. Food typically comes from three activities: growing crops, raising animals, and fishing. Modern farming methods do include a few harmful practices, like planting of very few genetic varieties. The majority of farmers practice monoculture, where they plant only one type of wheat, just as an example. The problem with that is that a single type of parasite could then destroy the entire crop. It also means that one crop can seriously deplete the soil in that particular location of nutrients. When you practice polyculture, or you plant multiple types of crops, you see less soil depletion and more minerals being returned to the soil. Heavy use of fertilizers, pesticides, and herbicides can also cause significant damage to the ecosystem. Fertilizer production is energy intensive, and fertilizer runoff contributes to water pollution. Some pesticides and herbicides have been linked to cancer, so not only is it dangerous to the environment, but it's dangerous to the individuals who consume who ingest those pesticides and herbicides. Agricultural runoff places those chemicals directly into our water supply. Another danger that farmers need to be conscious of is too generous of irrigation. Water is sometimes withdrawn from aquifers for crop irrigation, and it can greatly deplete the water ground table. Excessive fuel consumption. Irrigation pumps remove water from aquifers, but a lot of times those rely on fossil fuels the burning of those fossil fuels in order to pump water out of those aquifers. Large farming machines use lots of fossil fuels as well. However, there are a lot of ways to minimize the harmful effects of farming. Polyculture, like the planting of two or more different crops in the same area. So for example, planting alfalfa in between strips of corn to replenish the nitrogen content in the soil can be done, so that way fertilizer doesn't have to be added to the soil. Contour farming conserves topsoil because it produces agricultural runoff. So here is an example of contour farming. Planting and plowing according to the slope of the land allows the water to naturally drain downhill. So we can use that agricultural runoff. So any sort of runoff from the plants up here can be used to water the plants down there. This is going to require significantly less irrigation. No-till farming also allows the previous crops to remain on the land, so that way you don't have to till up the soil every year. Biological control, that would be the use of natural predators to destroy organisms that harm crops. This helps reduce the needs for pesticides. Land suitable for farming is being degraded worldwide. Planting the same crop in straight rows has caused the United States and Canada to have one of the highest rates of soil erosion in the world. Altering farming practices can save farmers billions of dollars annually in fertilizer costs, because we don't have to worry about soil erosion and mineral depletion. So there have been something that we like to refer to as green revolutions. This is going to be where we see a huge shift in the practices to help focus on creating greener, more sustainable farming practices. So 50 years ago, researchers began to breed crops specifically for farmers in less developed countries. The dramatic increase in yield was called the green evolution. Most of these plants needed high levels. Unfortunately, though, most of these plants needed high levels of fertilizer, water, and pesticides. Genetic engineering produces transgenic plants with new and different traits. So things like resistance to insects and herbicides can be inserted into plant DNA. Weeds are controlled more easily, less tillage is needed, and even soil erosion can be greatly reduced. We're going to pause right there, and we'll pick up in our next video.